Welcome to the Montana Real Estate Channel, brought to you by Siphers Family Real Estate, where we've proudly been serving Western Montana since 1966. I'm Craig Siphers, and along with my daughter Erica, we work at Exit Realty Bitterroot South in Hamilton, Montana. And today we're exploring one of the most extraordinary tales in geological history. And that's the story of Glacial Lake Missoula and the cataclysmic floods that accompanied that and shaped the landscape of the Pacific Northwest. We've been helping folks move in and around the state of Montana since 1966, and we get calls and texts and emails from folks just like yourself almost every day. And so we invite you to get a hold of us, use us as a resource. All the information you need is in the description down below. And so let's go ahead. This is just not a story about water and ice. It's a story of unimaginable natural forces, dramatic transformation, and a landscape that has been shaped over thousands of years. Now, from the sheer size of the lake to the repeated earth-shattering floods that followed, we're going to dive deep into the science, the history, and the impact of this prehistoric marvel. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let's take a trip back into prehistoric Montana, which was home to one of the most powerful natural phenomena in North American history. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's start with the vastness of Glacial Lake Missoula. You know, with the basics, how big was Glacial Lake Missoula? Well, the answer is absolutely massive. Picture a lake that covers over 3,000 square miles, stretching across much of western Montana. Now, this wasn't your ordinary body of water. At its deepest point, Glacial Lake Missoula reached over 2,000 feet, which is nearly half a mile deep. Now, to put it in perspective, the depth of this lake was greater than the height of the Empire State Building, and it was holding over 500 cubic miles of water. That's enough water to fill all of today's Great Lakes combined and still have some left over. Now, the lake was so vast, it submerged the modern-day city of Missoula. In fact, the lake was higher by about 400 feet than the M that you see on the mountainside above the University of Montana. And it extended far into the Bitterroot Valley and the Flathead Valley to the north. Entire valleys that we know of and love today, like the Bitterroot and were completely underwater. Western Montana was quite literally an inland lake. So the question is how the lake was formed. Well, how was this enormous lake formed? Well, the story begins during the last ice age, roughly 15 to 20,000 years ago. At that time, the Earth's climate was obviously much colder, and glaciers were on the move. A massive glacier known as the Cordilleran ice sheet and a portion of it called the Purcell Lobe advanced from Canada into northern Idaho and western Montana. Now, this glacier blocked the Clark Fork River, creating a natural dam made entirely of ice. Now, this dam was no small obstacle. It was estimated to be over 2,000 feet tall and the same height as the deepest part of the lake. And as the glacier advanced, water from melting ice and nearby rivers blocked it up, filling the valleys of Montana and creating Glacial Lake Missoula. Now, this ice dam was what geologists call basically a perfect storm. It was strong enough to hold back the water, but not forever. Over time, the weight of the water pressing against the dam caused it to weaken, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic natural events in history. Next is the Cataclysmic Floods. Yeah, that's right. Now here's where things get really interesting and truly extraordinary. Eventually, the pressure of the water against the ice dam became too great, and the dam gave way, unleashing a catastrophic flood of epic proportions. We're not talking about your average flood. This was a mega flood. When the dam broke, over 500 cubic miles of water were released in just a few days. That's the equivalent of draining Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined at a speed of 80 miles per hour. Now, imagine a wall of water hundreds of feet high racing across the landscape. This torrent carved through mountains, scoured valleys, and carried boulders the size of cars hundreds of miles. The sound alone must have been deafening, as trillions of gallons of water reshaped the land in a matter of hours. The floodwaters traveled westward, carving the dramatic scablands in Washington state and eventually reaching the Pacific Ocean. And along the way, they left behind massive ripple marks, deep coulees, and other features that geologists still study today. Now, this catastrophe repeated itself many times. And now that's right, this is where it gets even more mind-blowing. This wasn't a one-time event. Scientists believe that Glacial Lake Missoula filled and emptied at least 40 times over several thousand years. Each time the lake filled, it would take decades or even centuries for the water to reach its full capacity. But when the dam failed, the floods were almost instantaneous, transforming the landscape in a mere days. Now, imagine living in this region during this period of time. Well, if humans were present, they would have witnessed some of the most powerful natural forces ever recorded on Earth. Each flood would have an apocalyptic event, it would have been, and reshaping the land with unparalleled intensity. So let's talk about the landscapes that were left behind. The legacy of these floods is around us everywhere. Here in Montana, near Missoula, you can find giant ripple marks, some up to 50 feet, recorded by these powerful floods, like out in Camas Prairie. And here's what it looks like from Google Earth, so that you can get a feel for, kind of the direction of the water. And it's just like being at the beach. You can see the ripple marks, but these are enormous. These ripple marks here, you can actually see the direction that the water was flowing over this area of Camas Prairie from outer space on Google Earth. And of course, you can also see the shorelines. You can see them above the M in Missoula. And here's just a little piece about some area around Stevensville.
Here we are overlooking Erica, my partner and daughter, her great-grandparents' ranch that was in the family since homestead days back in the 1860s. This is up Ambrose Creek in the Bitterroot Valley, and over my shoulder are the shoreline of the Glacial Lake Missoula. If you can imagine, we would have probably been underwater here back 14,000 years ago. So I'm going to take an up-close video of that shoreline so you can see it as we go along in this video about Glacial Lake Missoula.
This is another example of Glacial Lake Missoula strand lines, and these are just a little northeast of Corvallis, Montana. These old shorelines and the ripple marks are like fingerprints of Glacial Lake Missoula, etched in the landscape for eternity. Now, further downstream, the floodwaters carved the channeled scablands of Washington, a region filled with dramatic coulees, dry waterfalls, and massive boulders transported hundreds of miles from their original locations. And of course, one of the most famous is Dry Falls, a waterfall that during the floods would have been nearly 10 times the size of Niagara Falls. Even as far as Oregon's Willamette Valley, the floods deposited rich sediment, creating some of the most fertile farmland in the Pacific Northwest. Now, the scale of these floods is truly hard to comprehend. Now, how do we know this happened? Well, the story of Glacial Lake Missoula might have been lost to history and time if it were not work of geologists like J. Harlen Bretz. And in the 1920s, Bretz studied the channeled scab lands of Washington and proposed that they were formed by massive floods. There were other geologists as well. And at first, Bretz's ideas were met with skepticism and ridicule, but most scientists, they just couldn't believe that such a catastrophic event could have taken place. But over time, evidence began to pile up, well, literally, where geologists found giant ripple marks like we've seen, of course, the flood-carved valleys and even stranded ice-rafted boulders, proving Bretz's theory correct. Now, today, geologists use advanced technology from satellite imaging to sediment analysis to piece together the story of Glacial Lake Missoula and the massive floods. And their work continues to reveal new insights about the power of nature and the history of our planet. Well, what does that mean for us today? Well, so really what does it matter? I guess it's a fascinating piece of natural history for one. And that helps us understand how the landscapes we live in were formed. You know, the hills, the valleys, the fertile plains of Montana and the Pacific Northwest, they just wouldn't be the same without these floods that took place. But it's also a reminder of nature's power and unpredictability. Understanding events like these can help us prepare for future catastrophes. It also can help us with, you know, things like climate change, natural disasters, or other geological phenomena. Remember, you want to see our natural disaster video too. I personally like it as being one of the better ones. And for those of us in real estate, it's an incredible to think about the how history influences land where we build, farm, and live. Everything from the Bitterroot Valley up to the Flathead and over east, it's the legacy of Glacial Lake Missoula, which is part of what makes Montana so great. So we hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the history of Glacial Lake Missoula. It's a story of incredible forces, dramatic events, and landscape shaped by time and water. And until the next video, be well.